Hey everyone, I'm Alex from Cytonox, and today I'll be ranking the dungeons of The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker from worst to best. A quick channel update is in order first, being that our upload rate will temporarily be far slower, in case you hadn't noticed the uncharacteristic 3-week-long Cyto content drought. Jack and I are both heading out to college, me on the 26th and him right this very moment as a matter of fact. We hate to disappoint, but we'll need some time to settle into our new digs and get a good system going for running the channel. Adjusting from working in my spacious basement room to tiny dorms 280 miles away from each other will take a little time, so give us a few months of leeway for that to work itself out. Anyways, now for the part you guys were waiting for. As you may recall, Wind Waker is actually dead at the bottom of my 3D Zelda game ranking. This is by no means to imply I don't like the game, which I do very much, so don't get me wrong. I just think the dungeon roster is rather weak, and that happens to be my favorite aspect of Zelda games, along with collecting heart pieces. It is what it is. I will make a 3D Zelda game ranking at the end of this broader series, however, and explain myself more in depth if you're curious. But for now, let's take it one step at a time and delve into the dungeons of the toon-styled Black Sheep, if you can really call it that, loved as it is by many. As I mentioned in the Skyward Sword dungeon ranking, I hate just about every Zelda final dungeon there is other than in Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild. Indeed, the time-dishonored formula of jamming the most annoying aspects of past dungeons into one jumbled, unoriginal thematic mess is one I've never taken to. This one, in particular, however, is a real nasty piece of work. Look, I'm prone to hyperbole. Everything I find slightly unpleasant gets described on here as if it's an ordeal from hell specifically designed to torture me, I know. But let me make this perfectly clear, no joking around. This dungeon actually fucking sucks. Like, it is literally the worst dungeon in the entire series in my opinion. I dread it like a death sentence whenever I replay Wind Waker, and it's the reason I tend to drop the game after the Wind Temple more often than not. Making the reward for the tedious Triforce Hunted dungeon this horrible is just insult to injury. It's like if you shined someone's shoes for an hour and as a reward they kicked you in the face. This isn't just a case of being frustrating, but still fun like a tricky platforming section or a boss fight. I literally would rather watch paint dry or solve math problems than slog through this garbage. Ganon can shove his stupid fucking tower up his asshole. Maybe if he's feeling considerate, he can get into pig form first to make a nice rotisserie. First off, you get 4 rows that all lead to a refight with one of the bosses. The game isn't that long, so it feels a bit redundant. I just fought these assholes like a few hours ago. Piss off with this Mega Man bullshit. Of course, there isn't a Tower of the Gods segment either, which, spoiler alert, is the best dungeon by far. Almost all of the boss routes bring my piss to a boil too. If my piss could actually boil, then that segment on the way to Goma would have my bladder whining like a tea kettle. Why the fuck did they never tell you could climb on top of those tiny little beams you grapple off of? That is so fucking unintuitive. I spent like 30 minutes at least trying to make an impossible jump, thinking I was just an idiot for not being able to pull it off. This is some shit I'd expect from Portal 2 during that middle part of the game where you're out of the test chambers and screwing around in Cave Johnson's place. This dungeon is more frustrating than that heart piece for hitting Orca 500 times, and that means something. The Earth Temple Pass is just a long, boring hallway of the same puzzle repeated multiple times. The Forbidden Woods segment is one of those janky Korok Leaf lift segments. The Wind Temple segment is the only passable part of this entire dungeon. After that, you just have a long, drawn-out Phantom Ganon section, and that's it. There is no creativity to be found here. There is no fun to be had here. This sorry excuse for a dungeon is horrid in every way imaginable. I'd be less offended if they had me fight a bunch of bokoblins down a hallway and solve a cereal box maze at the end. Fuck this stupid-ass dungeon. Stealth in Zelda games almost always sucks. At best, it's stupid and easy like an Ocarina of Time, and at worst, it's dreadful dog shit like it is here. Having to worry about getting caught in Zelda games is stupid. I want to roll around like a freak and button mash these ugly mugs to death. Instead, you have to tiptoe around this fodder like a pussy. Your reward for clearing it the first time is absolutely nothing. You get your sword back and get sent flying out to Windfall Island, whoop-de-doo. At least the game is actually fun once that's over with. The second visit is also lame. You have all your gear, sure, but now it's full of all those obnoxious motherfuckers who spawn out of nowhere and make it impossible to walk on ledges or climb ladders or anything required to get from point A to point B. There's no way this was designed to be fun. It's like they want me to suffer. The only beacon of light in this depraved, wretched dung heap is the Skull Hammer, which is awesome. It's like being a strength build with fast rolls in Dark Souls, which is a real joy. If Wind Waker did anything right, it was Link's movement. You absolutely zoom around, even without rolling, and with it you become a bona fide force of nature. Plus, sometimes rolling upstairs works, and sometimes it doesn't, which I find really funny. The fun of using the hammer in this fashion is quickly snuffed out by the aforementioned imp creatures, though, so the relief is short-lived. The only thing Nintendo got right here is the name. It's most definitely a Forsaken Fortress, because there is nothing to be found in this hellhole other than boredom. And so we emerge from the sewers out to the garbage dump. The Earth Temple is a far cry from the horrors of the last two dungeons I talked about, but there are still a lot of issues that open it up to ridicule. First off, I gotta address the elephant in the room. The command melody sucks. The Wind Waker is already by far the worst Zelda instrument because you have to play the whole damn thing at the game's pace and not your own, but having to spam it is beyond frustrating. Why couldn't they make the Dominion Rod apply to people as well as statues or something? It's not awful doing it once, but it really begins to add up time-wise with all the use it gets. This dungeon is also ugly as shit. For such a generally colorful, amazing-looking game, this is a drab gray nothing area. I really like the look of the suns and the big face you gotta shine light onto, but that's pretty much ripped straight from the N64 games anyway, so it's not an Earth Temple original design. I usually love the mirror shield and find it tends to be housed within amazing dungeons, but this is just not one of them. It's not all bad though. The enemies are pretty solid here, and even though they look like Teletubbies, the pose in this game are significantly less frustrating than in other games. The mirror puzzle at the end is grand in scale, but sorta dumb because it pretty much tells you where to push everything. With this in mind, it becomes less of a puzzle and more just like pushing blocks around and trying to get Medley to stand in the light at a weird angle to act as a mirror. This dungeon is flawed, more than most even, but is far from the greatest evil in this game. A first dungeon at the halfway mark, not bad. I'd wager that this is actually one of the best first dungeons in this series, which is a real jarring change of tone for this video, I suppose. Unlike most, Dragon Roost Cavern takes the time to have a cool setting, a new unique dungeon item, and some vestige of difficulty. It's got lava, outdoor sections, and notable set pieces. That's enough to get, at the very least, a passable rating from me. The new item is a bit of a miss in my opinion, mostly due to the unskippable startup animation that comes with every use, but it's nowhere near command melody levels of annoying. The enemies are interesting. Having to make those worm guys shrivel up but not die to use them as weights on a switch was a good puzzle that might take first-time players a while to crack. The arena fight before getting the grappling hook is fun. I think this game has solid combat, so I dig when it makes you fight people on occasion. The layout of the dungeon is solid too. Not very hard to traverse if you need to backtrack somewhere, and it has an intuitive flow without being totally obvious where to go. It's definitely on the simple side and still linear as you'd expect from an introductory level, but I always enjoy it regardless. Not to be confused with the identically named Bloodborne area, these Forbidden Woods are far more colorful and enjoyable to traverse than its dreary, snake-ridden counterpart. I have my issues with this dungeon for sure, but they aren't crippling. The wooden lifts you move with the Korok leaf I mentioned earlier in the video are clunky to operate, which has definitely left me miffed before. The vertical nature of the dungeon makes it easy to fall down as well, which everybody knows can potentially be a giant pain in the ass. Those misfires aside, I love the look of the place and the enemies are pretty neat. I dig the moth guys as mini bosses and tiny sea urchin dudes are satisfying to slash away at in droves with spin attacks. The maze room with the floor vines is quite memorable, and the central multi-floor room is a nice hub. I think you can really boil down a lot of great dungeon designs to two requirements: have a good hub room, and have the side rooms be memorable. Bonus points if there's a way to modify the entire dungeon in some way, which adds some refreshing challenge into the mix. The boomerang is a fun item, satisfying chopping through vines and strings and whatnot. The lock-on feature gave it much more utility and character than it had in past games, where it felt a bit similar to other ranged tools like the slingshot and bow. As with most dungeons in Wind Waker, this one is none too puzzling, but it looks great and is very memorable, which goes a long ways. I know what you're probably thinking. If the command melody sucking was the primary reason the Earth Temple was so far down, why is the Wind Temple so high? Well, part of it is you use it far less often, or at least I feel like it's used less. Makar is also just an adorable little guy. Watching him buzz around with his leaf thing is more fun to me than watching Medley fly anyways. The Wind Temple is just far more interesting. Lots of cool vertical rooms, spike traps, and a noteworthy theme in my opinion. Very fitting, I'd say, and yet kind of mysterious nonetheless. This is definitely one of the more painless vertically oriented dungeons in this series, compared to dungeons like Snowhead Temple at least, where falling down is an incessant and grueling disturbance to your playing through it. The Korok leaf got some nice use again, and the hookshot is my favorite Zelda item, so of course I'm a wee bit biased. Very cool mechanism, you know, flying around on chains and embedding it into wood and grates and stuff. Very fun. I also like seeing Wizrobes in this game. I fuck with the toucan looking design. They've never looked better than here the way I see it. This is probably the hardest dungeon in the game in my opinion, which isn't saying all that much, but I'll give props where props is due. I wouldn't include this in a discussion of the best dungeons in the series or anything, but it's better than most of Wind Waker's other ones for sure. The Tower of the Gods is the best dungeon in Wind Waker, and water is wet. Kabam! That's the sound of it blowing every other dungeon out of the goddamn water. Originality-wise, this is one of the most interesting and out there dungeons in the series, and it's got fun value to match. You know it's going to be a strange one when you start off still riding the King of Red Lions. The puzzles in this opening bit are mostly just lame block-pushing ones, and waiting for the water tides to change is boring, but it's only a prelude to the real meat on the bone, and it's very novel stuff at least, so I don't mind a ton. Also, love the look of this dungeon. I love architecture full of faces and stuff like the Earth Temple from Skyward Sword, and this has those in spades. If I ever design a building, I'd totally put a giant evil jack-o'-lantern looking face on it or something. Also, the dungeon item, the Dominion Rod, really cool, I'm a fan. The way you move two guys around at once reminds me a bit of playing this game B-Cubed that was on Cool Math Games. Those were the days, let me tell ya. Anyways, I like the rest of the dungeon a good deal. I used to always get stuck at the part where you got a Korok leaf glide over the lasers. It's always fun when you forget an item exists and then remember after a while of being clueless. It's like rediscovering it almost. Link chucking the statues around is always hilarious to me too, considering he's only 12 or something. His overhead press is probably triple what mine is by the look of it, and that's before he gets the power bracelets. Toon Link is just overall monstrous. Between him and the Hero of Time, it's a pretty close matchup the way I see it. Sorry, off topic again. Very prone to rambling even when I'm scripting it. Tower of Gods, big fan, me likey, that's all. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. As was the case with Skyward Sword, next up I'll be tackling the bosses of Wind Waker, so stay tuned for that. That's all for now. Deuces.